This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning the show is Derrell Peel, Oklahoma State University livestock economist, with his cattle market outlook, where he discusses the Cattle on Feed report and what factors have been contributing to market movement. K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner continues today's show as he reminds cattle producers about the importance of mineral supplementation, especially phosphorus. Anita Clubine from Montgomery County ends the show with a segment of Faces in Agriculture, where she explains how her operation has evolved and expanded. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with the cattle market update from Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. Derrell, thanks for joining us today.
You bet. Happy to be here.
Derrell, how are the cattle markets looking overall?
I tell you, these cattle markets, obviously we had, we came into the year following a rough fourth quarter. And then we had a winter storm the end of January. So we've had a number of things, kind of challenges, but these markets are really strong. They're strengthening here in February and just moving on. It's the same trend that we've been on for a long time, but these markets are just really incredibly strong right now.
What are some factors you see when you look at the market that are maybe more of outside forces?
Yeah, well, obviously there's always lots of outside things. And so, as we're recording this, we have recent news that the Supreme Court has announced that Trump's tariffs are unconstitutional. So that changes a whole lot of things potentially going forward. Obviously, he's going to have a reaction to that. And markets were impacted a bit on Friday. I think there's a good chance we'll see a fair amount of volatility in these markets. Not so much from known impacts at this point, particularly from a cattle and beef perspective, but more so just because of the uncertainty associated with how this is all going to play out. So it's one more example of the things that create the volatility, probably relatively short-lived. But, we've been talking to producers for quite a few months now that even though we're in a generally bullish market environment, we really have to think about risk management from the standpoint of specific points in time when you need to market cattle, because anything can happen short term. And that's what we're seeing here right now. Another example of that.
When you're out talking to cattle producers, do you see them taking a bigger interest in risk management tools?
Yeah, absolutely. I think after the last few months, we've had several examples, be it political announcements or industry structure adjustments or Mexican border and animal health threat issues. There's any number of things that can create volatility. If you think about markets having a natural percentage of variation, just volatility that's inherent in the market, but, X% volatility in a market that's at record high levels is a bigger swing in prices when you get that volatility. And so we're seeing all of that stuff together, creating a lot of movement in these prices. Again, mostly short term, but creates a real challenge for producers to manage that relative to those points in time when they've got to be in the market and actively participating in the market.
A lot of times we mention the cattle market fundamentals, and do you see those continuing to hold strong?
They are. We're in the same situation. Obviously, if we go back to the January 1 inventory numbers that we got at the end of January from USDA, the beef cow herd got smaller, a little bit smaller than we expected last year. The idea that it could have been down a little wasn't a surprise, but it was down a full percentage point. And so, that number got smaller. That means we don't know for sure if we're at the bottom yet. 2025 could have been the low. It wasn't. And so is 2026 the low? More than likely it is. But now we won't know until this time next year when we get next year's number. So we're still trying to find a bottom in this thing. Now, the beef replacement heifers ticked up very slightly. Not enough to suggest that we're bottoming and for sure in herd expansion, but maybe to indicate that we're stabilizing a little bit. And all of that to say that we continue those strong fundamentals. We had the calf crop was smaller, a little bit smaller than expected as well. So we've got ever tighter feeder supplies going forward, and we still haven't retained enough heifers to rebuild this thing So the strong fundamentals continue, and the tightest supplies and the strongest of those fundamentals are yet ahead of us later this year, perhaps not even until next year. We have to wait and see.
You mentioned the cattle inventory report, but a report we got on Friday, February 20th, the cattle on feed report, and what did you see within there?
Yeah, you bet. So the February monthly cattle on feed report pegged the feedlot inventories for February 1 at 11.5 million head. That was down 1.8% on a year-over-year basis. Placements in January were down 4.7%, and marketings were down 13%. And all of those were pretty well anticipated. So from the standpoint of pre-report expectations, no real surprises in this report. But, it continues the trend we've been talking about. The February 1 inventory number makes the 15th consecutive month of year-over-year decreases in that monthly inventory number. It's been a slow process, but we are pulling those feedlot inventories down to reflect the fact that we've got very, very tight feeder cattle supplies.
And you mentioned dropping down 13%. Any guesses as to why that was?
I think most of it probably was due to the winter weather that we had. So we had a big storm right at the end of January. It affected a lot of feedlot country. So cattle didn't move. They were off feed temporarily or slowed down just because of the cold weather, and in some cases the snow. There just wasn't much movement. So I suspect it's just a month-to-month thing here where we probably took some cattle that didn't get marketed in January. They show up as this small marketings number. They'll get pushed into February. And so we'll have to kind of wait till next month's report and see how the two sort of average out. I don't think it was as dramatic as the 13% by itself would suggest.
You mentioned for the past 15 months being year over year further down. You think that trend's going to continue until we truly start rebuilding?
Yeah, we've still got a ways to go on this. Again, it's been a somewhat slow process. Obviously, feedlots are trying to hold inventories as long as they can. So even though there's less cattle in terms of placements and marketings, that reflects the feeder cattle supply. But feedlots have extended days on feed. In some cases, they're buying lighter weight cattle because that's what's available. So they're getting more days on the front end, and then they're feeding them to heavier weights on the back end. And so that allows them to maintain an inventory that holds up a little bit better than the underlying actual supply of cattle would suggest. But that's going to be harder and harder to do as we go forward. So I do expect to see these feedlot inventories continue to come down in the next, who knows, probably for the rest of the year for sure. Because again, as we go forward, the one thing that has stayed relatively strong in the feedlot demographics, if you will, is the fact that the heifer on feed percentage has stayed high, which is the flip side of saying we're not retaining heifers. We're putting them in the feedlots, we're feeding them out. And eventually we're going to hold more of those heifers for replacements. So we're going to have to pull that feedlot inventory down a little bit farther and a little bit faster probably at some point here.
And do you see any other impacts besides obviously the feedlots just having their cattle for longer and having heavier cattle at the end? Is that creating any other impacts within the market, within the industry?
Yeah, sure. So obviously one of the things that does, cattle stay on feed longer, they get bigger, so carcass weights have jumped sharply. And so what we are doing to some extent is trying to offset decreased cattle inventory with increased carcass weights or per head production. And so in 2025, for example, fed cattle slaughter was down between 5 and 6%. But because of the heavier carcass weights, total beef production in the country was down about 3.7%. And that's going to continue as well. We're starting 2025 with very strong carcass weights. Again, I don't know how far they can go. Frankly, I keep thinking they'll top out, but they haven't yet. And there are lots of incentives to push that as much as we can. Now, because of that winter weather that we had at the end of January, we may see a few weeks here. The data for slaughter weights is about 2 weeks delayed. So in the next couple of weeks, data that we get, which will really reflect that period during and after the storm, I suspect we'll see some short-term impact on those carcass weights just due to the winter weather effects. But that'll be fairly short-lived. It'll play out in a matter of a few weeks in the data, and then we'll be back on to whatever the underlying trend is for the year.
So, Derrell, as you've chatted with cattle producers, what else are they keeping an eye on, or what have you heard about?
Obviously, we're still questioning kind of when we're going to turn this around. Everybody kind of looks at each other and says, are you keeping heifers? Who's keeping heifers? Obviously, the data tells us that we're not doing it in any big concentrated, initiative here to as an industry to do it. There are some producers keeping heifers. and we had this slight uptick. I think we're going to, probably build a little more momentum on that as we go forward. Not that it's going to be real aggressive. I think there's lots of reasons why we're going to continue to see this be a very slow paced herd rebuilding effort, that it won't happen this year. We already know that. Any heifers that were going to enter the herd this year would have been heifers we saved 2 years ago. So all of that potential rebuild is still ahead of us. And so we still don't know how that's going to play out, but it looks like it's going to be a slow, sustained kind of a thing. And what that means basically is that we're going to be in similar market situation like we are now, probably for much of the rest of the decade.
So, Derrell, if you're just able to see what the cattle market's going to look like in the future, what do you think it's saying?
I think we're we're in a unique environment in some ways. This is a historically slow cattle cycle. We do still have a cattle cycle, and obviously one of the questions is, when we do rebuild, how much will we rebuild? Heavier carcass weights takes away some of the need for rebuilding. It won't take as many cattle to produce beef. On the other hand, if you think about out in the future at some point, how big can this industry be? I think it can be about as big as we want it to be in terms of global market potential, for example. I don't think we know for sure. We know that we need to be a little bigger than we are, and we will rebuild to some extent. I think it remains to be seen just kind of how much we might rebuild and how much potential there is when you combine the domestic market, which is always our biggest component of the market, but then with the very dynamic potential that there is in global beef markets. I think we have a lot of potential to be about as big as we want to be as an industry.
Derrell, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
You bet. Happy to do it.
That was Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing this month's Feedlot Facts, which is cow herd mineral supplement selection focused towards phosphorus. And to talk about it, we're joined by K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner. Justin, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Shelby, for the opportunity.
Justin, why are we taking a look at mineral supplementation this time of year?
Yeah, so great question to really start the conversation off. So, oftentimes many companies in the late winter or early spring will start to solicit some pre-order early booking discounts for different mineral programs for the upcoming grazing season. And so it just seems like with all things, those decisions and those opportunities start to get pushed back further and further. I know, right, very fortunate to have some very nice weather here, late winter in February for most of Kansas. Makes it feel like spring, although, that upcoming grazing season does seem like it's a ways off. It's really right around the corner. And so oftentimes that's when we start to get questions about mineral supplement selection. And I'll say out the gate, I think right now, producers have a lot of different options when it comes to selecting mineral programs. There's different products. We have different companies. We have different mineral formulations, maybe more so than what we've had in the past. There just seems like there's more opportunities or more products to choose from, and more opportunities to really compare products that may fit a particular situation, maybe a little better than others. And so one of the things that I like to do is always kind of make a decision tree, kind of start to think about what's kind of that first tier decision. What, as a producer, do I need to kind of look at to make sure, how do I narrow this decision up just a bit? If I've got 4 to 5 different products that I may be looking at. And so, really the first step in that is to look at that mineral tag. There's a tremendous amount of information that can be found on those tags. In terms of, product levels, obviously, but also intake. We can also look at, the kind of the targets and what those are. Oftentimes what I'll tell producers when we're going through and having these conversations is, in terms of a specialist, if you just simply take a picture of those mineral tags or can provide me with that basic information, we go a long ways from really doing a comparison between product A and product B, and just do a much better job if we got all that information. And most of the information we're going to need to make that decision, or at least a big component of that, is going to be found on that mineral tag in terms of the product. Now, there's obviously some other things that we take into account, right? In terms of cow requirements, right? What do those look like? And then we have to balance that with, what's the forage level? What's the base diet have in terms of those concentrations?
With a focus on phosphorus on the decision tree, where would that rank for cattle producers?
Yeah, so a lot of times phosphorus is one of the reasons we provide mineral supplementation to cattle in extensive environments. And so phosphorus is one of the most common mineral deficiencies in grazing systems around the world. So not just here in Kansas. So it's very common. And so that's why for me, that's really that first tier in that decision process, right? Is looking at the phosphorus concentration, kind of understanding where those requirements are at for the cows, how those vary, but also kind of the forage production level. And so here in Kansas, forage phosphorus concentrations do vary. They're typically greatest during the spring and lowest in the summer. So if you think really that early vegetative spring grass that's out there, that's going to be higher in phosphorus content, and then it's going to steadily decline as that forage matures, and then typically it's going to be its lowest during the dormant period during the winter months. And so if we look at Kansas, it's a fairly narrow range between 0.15 and 0.2% on a dry matter basis. So that makes our decision a little bit easier in some respects. And if we look at the maintenance requirements, kind of the other side of that of a lactating cow, we can start to put some upper and lower boundaries on what might work in terms of a mineral program that's out there. So phosphorus really becomes the basis of that. And so, oftentimes in the spring, we're dealing with a lactating cow, average milk production, 20 pounds of peak lactation per day, maintenance mature body weight. We're looking at a cow that's probably going to be between 12 and 1,400 pounds. And so in a lot of scenarios that are out there that would be very common in Kansas, the phosphorus content of a mineral needs to be somewhere between 6 and 10% to meet the cow requirements for that lactating, 12 to 1,400 pound female at the level of phosphorus that we would see commonly in our forage system here within Kansas. And so that can be a really good baseline to make that decision of, well, okay, do I need used to be very common to see a 12-12 mineral that had 12% phosphorus, 12% calcium, 12% salt. Today, we don't see as many of those higher level or mineral products that contain higher levels of phosphorus. That also adds expense to the mineral. And so as one of those more expensive components potentially of that mineral product that's out there. So we see some more opportunities to select that. Obviously, if you're very early on or if you have higher producing cows, you might want to consider, a phosphorus, the phosphorus or a mineral that has a higher percent phosphorus in it to account for some of that. In many cases, consulting with an extension specialist, kind of working through what fits your scenario. And we talked about that it's much easier now than it's ever been to really compare those products as we look at what may particular fit a particular operation.
And we can provide cattle with all the phosphorus possible in a mineral supplementation, but how can we make sure that they're actually consuming it?
Yeah, so, kind of a good question, and maybe just a point of discussion there. So we also want to be cautious of over supplementing, right? So as we look at where is that additional phosphorus, if we greatly exceed the requirements of that animal, they're going to be excreted. And so phosphorus is one of those where we certainly need to be aware of over supplementing, and we certainly want to be aware of that. Like that's, in terms of the potential impacts on our environment as that gets excreted. There's a variety of reasons we might want to, not necessarily advocate for over supplementing if possible, right? The other part of that, of your question there, really gets to intake and consumption. And so we also want to look at those target consumption levels. And so, we commonly see, 2 to 4 ounce, target intake levels on most cattle mineral products that are out there. That's another good bit of information that can be utilized or found on that mineral tag is here is what that mineral was formulated for. This is the targeted intake level of this mineral. Now, the follow-up to that often we don't do in the production setting is look at and say, okay, did we actually achieve that target intake? How close were we? And we know there's variability that exists within the cow herd. There's obviously cows. We look at the average, right? How much mineral did they go through? We put out a sack, we put out another sack, and then, how long did it last, right? So we have to do a little bit of math to work backwards from that a lot of times to see what that target level is. And we also know that there's cows that have probably never consumed mineral, right? That it's part of that variability. So, and we do see some products that, obviously may, kind of target a higher intake level, right? And make sure that mineral is going to be palatable and that the cattle are actually going to consume it. Those are all additional factors to consider as well.
What else besides phosphorus would you find important to make sure is included in that mineral?
So, commercial mineral products that are available, there's a lot of different things. As we get into vitamin levels, those are also important as we start to look and really starting to tailor those mineral programs to an operation, right? So there's kind of there's a bit of a laundry list, vitamin A and all of those things that we would consider, that may be different between different mineral packages. Some of those may be very appropriate for one operation, where another operation, depending on the production setting or, other ingredients that they may supplement into the diet or their supplementation program, might impact that decision as well.
What resources are available for cattle producers if they're wanting to look at this for their herd?
Yeah, and so as we have a conversation, here with producers, oftentimes it's easier to see things in a table form and kind of look at the total diet package, especially when we get into looking at mineral supplementation programs and evaluating mineral products that are out there. So www.ksubeef.org is really where we put a lot of our resources at K-State within the KSU beef team. We've got several articles that are out there on phosphorus, and so I'd really encourage producers to take the time, if this is something they're interested in, to either call a specialist or to look at some of those resources and we can really start to simplify that process in terms of evaluating those different products that are out there and really help you make a more informed purchasing decision, if you will.
Justin, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
That was K-State beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner. If you'd like to read more on this topic, I will link an article from the ASI newsletter in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Also in the show notes will be the KSU Beef website, where Justin mentioned you can find more resources. That website, once again, is www.ksubeef.org. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll have this month's Faces in Agriculture. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show with another segment of Faces in Agriculture. And this week we're joined with someone involved in agriculture in Montgomery County, Anita Clubine. Anita, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Anita, what is your involvement in agriculture?
We raise cattle. We have a cow-calf operation. We have a custom haying operation. We are getting into a little bit of row cropping and cover crops.
How have you grown into having haying, cover crops, and cattle?
How have we grown into this? Out of necessity, for one thing, just figuring out, we don't know what a box looks like. We are always thinking outside of the box. So we kind of roll. And when we see something that ain't working, we nix that idea and move on to something completely different. So how did we get here? Phil and I've been married for 40 plus years. And so therefore we just we roll with the punches, what life will allow us to do and what God has a plan for.
And with your thinking outside the box ideas, what have been some of them that have been successful?
Well, we've always sold beef by the side. When the world went to shutting down and price at the market went to pot, we decided we wanted to do our own thing. We got tired of everybody else telling us what our cattle were worth. We know what we've got. So we started doing some retailing, started figuring out the red tape on getting all that lined out. And I had shoulder surgery, so I was in the house for a while. So it was my job to get it all taken care of. And by that fall, we had butcher dates and we had meat, and we go to farmer markets and sell it by the pound. We currently are going to 5 different farmers markets each week during the season, and it's a family affair. On Saturday morning, we have 2 of them. So, and we take trailers. We have enclosed trailers with deep freezers in them, and they're all divided into cubby holes. And so you can go directly to that cut. You don't carry ice chests and break your back. And we have a lot of fun doing it. We've met a lot of people, and we have learned that people just don't understand agriculture. And so we're also allowed the time with face-to-face customers and telling our story, letting people know that, that meat is coming from a producer somewhere, and that any grocery store doesn't just go to the other grocery store and pick it up and bring it to you and have it available. And so they're learning, we're learning. When I first started doing this, I would come home from a market and be completely exhausted. And Bill and Levi, our son Levi, they would be like, "So why are you so tired, Mom?" And I'm like, "People, they wear me out." Yeah, that's how we kind of got into that. And it's growed. Like I said, we're now in 5 different markets, and during the wintertime, we take orders and meet people in town in a public parking lot and do deliveries. There's a few folks during the wintertime, the elderly folks, I some do go right to their door with it, so if they don't have to get out, because I do it in the evening after I've already fed all day and all that. So, it works out really well. So,
Anita, from your perspective, what makes you excited about the future of agriculture?
Seeing the young people who are trying to be involved, the new ideas that they have for diversifying, expanding, it's kind of exciting to see how they think we're doing it wrong. Then when they try to do it their way, then they're like, "Oh, maybe you weren't doing it so wrong."
Anita, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
You bet, not a problem. I enjoyed it.
That was Anita Clubine, who's involved in agriculture in Montgomery County. That's what we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.